During this session, I'll highlight information found in Chapter 2 of the National Pesticide Applicators Certification Core Manual, which pertains to federal pesticide laws and regulations. Don't worry, this presentation is not as intense and dry as it sounds. It's also the shortest session in the course, but it's jam-packed with important information. This presentation is going to be very heavy on the acronyms, so let's start it all off with the first one, FIFRA. FIFRA stands for the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. It sets the framework for regulations for the production, transportation, sale, use, and disposal of pesticides. People often ask why the Act doesn't include an H for herbicides in the title. That's a good question because certainly herbicides and other types of pesticides are widely used and regulated. Interestingly, the original FIFRA was passed into Congress in 1947 as an expansion of the Federal Insecticide Act of 1910. At that time, there were concerns about labeling and adulteration of insecticides, fungicides, and rodenticides. If you remember our previous session on pest management, we started with historically significant pest problems, which included blight, a fungal disease in potatoes leading to the potato famine, mosquitoes causing malaria, and rats and fleas causing the bubonic plague. This gives context about pests of concern in that era and pesticides produced to manage them. Measures to protect human and environmental health added in 1972, not long after a book titled Silent Spring was published. FIFRA was amended again in 1975, 1978, and 1988. This shows you that federal pesticide laws have been in effect for over 100 years and evolve as new concerns develop. FIFRA originally focused on pesticide labeling. You'll hear many times throughout the course, reading and following pesticide labels is the law. Labels are designed to protect you, other people, and the environment. Not only do labels provide use instructions, they also provide precautions and safety measures you must follow when working with the product. Some include restrictions and things you're prohibited from doing. There are only a few exceptions to the label. As you read a couple of them, you might wonder why someone would do that. From a legal standpoint, unless specifically prohibited on the label, you are allowed to mix a pesticide with a fertilizer. Use any method of application. Remember, though, to read the label thoroughly and make sure you don't overlook something. Sometimes a label will have a section called chemigation, which includes types of chemigation systems you can use and those you can't use. Apply a pesticide to a pest not listed on the label if the crop, animal, or site is listed on the label. This is one of those things you might wonder about. It doesn't make much sense to apply a pesticide to a pest not listed on the label because it's possible it's not effective in controlling that pest. However, as long as it's registered for use on the crop, animal, or site you're treating, you will not be breaking the law. Apply a pesticide at a rate or dose lower than that listed on the label, except in the case of termiticides for pre-construction treatments. This is another scenario that might not make much sense because applying below the labeled rate might not result in effective pest control. A waste of time, money, and product, but not a violation. Keep in mind though, if you perform any of the four on this list, you're responsible for the end result, not the pesticide manufacturer. Now, this is a list of what could be considered unlawful acts by a pesticide manufacturer, seller, distributor, or user. However, if you look closely, many pertain to labeling and marketing. If you're going to tell someone they must read and follow the label, you need to make sure the label is correct, legible, legal, and represents the product in the container. There can be hefty fines for most of the following violations: distributing, selling, or delivering an unregistered product, false advertisement claims, selling any registered pesticide if its content doesn't conform to the labeling data, selling a misbranded or adulterated product, detaching, destroying, or altering the container label, refusing to keep records or refusing inspections, making a guarantee other than what is specified by the label, advertising an RUP without giving the product classification. making an RUP available to a non-certified applicator, using a pesticide in any manner inconsistent with the labeling. The previous list of violations really zeroed in on the product inside the container and the label affixed to the container. But what do you do with the container itself once that product is gone? There are regulations addressing the safe use, refill, and disposal of containers. One is simply called the container containment, which sounds odd, but it truly is a container containment. Commercial applicators with pesticides in containers greater than 500 gallons need to verify the large containers are secure by surrounding them in secondary containment structure. Many operations and applicators will be purchasing smaller containers of pesticides. They must follow label instructions for container cleaning, storage, and disposal of those containers. If you happen to have an empty pesticide container and don't know what to do with it after it's triple rinsed, check with your dealer, the manufacturer, or local regulatory agency to ask about pesticide and container recycling and collection events in your area. The photo on this slide is from an EPA-sponsored unusable pesticide collection event in Arizona. There might be a similar event near you. You're probably more familiar with inspectors who work for the Kentucky Department of Agriculture Division of Environmental Services. They have been provided the authority to administer programs and enforce pesticide laws in their jurisdiction under the EPA's direction. The EPA has the authority to impose civil and/or criminal penalties on anyone who misuses a pesticide or violates pesticide laws and regulations. Stop sale or use of a pesticide. Issue orders to seize or remove a product from market if EPA determines it poses an unreasonable risk. Reevaluate older products to see if they meet newer safety standards. Protect agricultural workers and pesticide handlers from pesticide exposure. And require certification of applicators of restricted use pesticides. Restricted use pesticides are those the EPA has found to cause unreasonable harm to human health and/or the environment. Therefore, they've placed restrictions on people who can purchase, use, or directly supervise the use of those products. Only certified applicators can purchase, use, or directly supervise the use of RUPs. As was just explained, only certified applicators can buy, use, or supervise the use of RUPs. Certified applicators can be broken down into two categories, private and commercial. Once you break down the definitions a bit, it's easy to differentiate between the two certifications. A private applicator is certified to use RUPs for producing an ag commodity on their employer's property or on property they own, rent, or lease. A commercial applicator is the opposite. They're certified to use RUPs for producing an ag commodity not owned by them or their employer. In state regulations, you might see additional criteria, such as applies RUPs for compensation on property not owned by them or their employer. If you own or work for an agricultural operation, you've probably heard of the Worker Protection Standard. The Worker Protection Standard was designed for exactly that, for worker protection, specifically for non-certified pesticide handlers and agricultural workers. While the slide on the screen only highlights a few requirements under the standard, they focus on providing information and protections for agricultural employees who either handle pesticides or who work in areas within 30 days of the end of a pesticide REI. For example, information about the pesticide applications at work needs to be readily available to the employees on their workdays. Some of the protections include decontamination supplies for all and PPE for handlers. A large part of the WPS focuses on employees' rights, such as the right to receive transportation to a nearby medical facility and treatment for symptoms should they become exposed to pesticides. Much of the information is provided to employees during their annual WPS pesticide safety training, which must be documented through training records maintained by the employer. If you need additional information about WPS, you can find training materials and programs through your Extension Office, Kentucky Department of Agriculture, EPA, or the Pesticide Educational Resources Collaborative. Before allowing the use of a pesticide on food crops, the EPA sets a tolerance. A tolerance is the maximum amount of pesticide residue that may legally remain on crops, animals, and animal products like eggs and milk to be sold for food or feed. In setting the tolerance, EPA must find the level at which the pesticide can be used with a reasonable certainty of no harm. Pesticide manufacturers send EPA a variety of scientific studies for review before the EPA sets a tolerance. To set the tolerance, the EPA takes into consideration the toxicity of the pesticide and its breakdown products, how much of the pesticide has been applied, the frequency of applications, and the amount of residue remaining in or on food by the time it's marketed or prepared. As new science, standards, and safety concerns evolve, there's a need for a reassessment and possible re-registration of older pesticides. The EPA reviews older pesticides to ensure they meet current scientific and regulatory standards. The agency also reevaluates these products to ensure products in the marketplace can still be used safely. Some recognized risks require changes to the label language, REI, PPE, application rates, or they result in the removal of some uses to ensure the safety of humans and the environment. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is another statute that provides the EPA with regulatory authority for pesticides. The FFDCA governs pesticide tolerance for food and feed products, which includes the maximum level of residues not only in human food, but also in animal feed. It's administered by both the EPA and the Food and Drug Administration. The Food Quality Protection Act looks at pesticide residues, but its focus is explicitly on exposures to children and infants. FQPA also takes into consideration the combined and cumulative risk of exposures. It looks into the risk of pesticide residues in food, drinking water, and residential lawns. And it also includes tests for endocrine disruption potential. Endocrine disruptors may be linked to a variety of developmental, behavioral, sexual, and reproductive problems. The EPA also reviews pesticides for their impacts on wildlife, especially endangered species that might be in or around the areas where pesticides are used. The Endangered Species Act is a federal law administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and National Marine Fisheries Service. Under the ESA, it's illegal to kill, harm, collect, threaten, or remove species or destroy their habitat. You might be very familiar with animals and birds listed as endangered species, but the list also contains endangered insects, fish, reptiles, amphibians, arachnids, crustaceans, and plants. Any pesticide that might negatively impact federally listed, threatened, or endangered species or their critical habitat will have endangered species protection requirements and use restrictions listed on the label. Take a look at these photos. We have a picture of a desert tortoise, a white-tailed deer, and monarch butterflies. Which of these is listed as an endangered species? It depends on when and where. For example, the desert tortoise is listed as an endangered species throughout the U.S. The white-tailed deer is listed as an endangered species in Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. A request to add the monarch butterfly to the endangered species list was submitted in 2020, and their population numbers are being reviewed. There was a significant decline in 2020, but several newspaper articles published in late 2021 mention that their numbers are now increasing. How would you know if you have endangered species in the area where you apply pesticides? And if you do have them, what can you do? Follow the label directions for any requirements or restrictions. The requirements and restrictions might include monitoring to ensure that the species is not present. You might also implement small to large buffer zones or prohibit use of pesticides during certain times. If there's not a label statement relating to endangered species, it's possible the pesticide has not been found to impact endangered species, or the EPA is still going through registration review and implementing the required restrictions. However, that doesn't necessarily mean you're in the clear. Your next step is to check the EPA's Bulletins Live 2 website. When using pesticides, you must follow the measures contained in the bulletin for the county in which pesticides will be applied. To determine whether a bulletin exists for the county, go to the EPA's Bulletins Live 2 website. Not everyone is familiar with the EPA's Bulletins Live 2 website and how it works, so I thought it would be a good idea to show you in this course. I'll begin by opening the website you see on the screen. As a group, we can set up a scenario as a tutorial, following the directions. Where are we going to apply our pesticide? What month and year? And what's the active ingredient or active ingredients? You're required to keep records listing the pesticide you applied, when, where, and how you applied it. We have a private applicator record book you can use available through your county extension office. Even broader, your records will also show your efforts to protect other people, crops, groundwater, and the environment. Having documentation of previous application details such as pest, product, active ingredient, site location, dates, rates, and weather conditions can help you when making future pest control decisions. Pesticide use records are also helpful for federal and state surveys to get an overview of use patterns in a certain area or industry. USDA administers a pesticide application record-keeping program, and Kentucky requires certified pesticide applicators to maintain their records for 3 years.